Hello everyone, welcome back to Upside Down Data. Today I want to talk about a new risk indicator we just launched for Avalanche and its native token AVAX. If you like the content, remember to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, and follow us on Twitter where we put out regular updates about our risk indicators and more. So you asked for it, and here it is, our risk indicator for AVAX. And of course, given what AVAX has been doing in the last few days, I think probably a lot of us were curious about how risky is AVAX right now. It's in the middle of this parabolic move to the upside, been blowing past, total price discovery. We're well above previous all-time highs now, really kind of going into a mode similar to what Solana did coming out of the summer, just going parabolic, looking for what the top might be. And so that's where it's, I think, useful to look at a tool like the UDPI, our risk indicator, and see what does it make of AVAX's recent price action. How risky does it believe AVAX is right now? So if you're returning to the channel, you're familiar with this type of graph. What I'm showing you here is the price action of AVAX over time. So each dot is a day, and each day is color-coded based on the output of our risk indicator, the UDPI, or the upside downside potential indicator. Score of 5 means high risk. Score of -5 means low risk. And what you can see, if you just look at this, is that the UDPI does a great job of identifying these tops, these points where the upside potential had really gotten tapped out. That's essentially what these high scores mean. The upside potential is quite low, downside potential is quite high, as well as identifying these low risk periods where the downside potential was quite low, but the upside potential was quite high. And of course, coming out of the summer where we're trading between $9 and $10, thinking about a $9 to $10 AVAX now, where we are right now, where it was around $130 last I checked before I started recording here, that's a pretty sweet deal. And I think we've gotten up to around $150. So it's about a 15x move since just the summer, which is quite impressive, which is a little bit absurd. And I think the AVAX price history is kind of an interesting one to look at as well, because, AVAX had an 84% drop from here to here, and then now has put in a 15x move to the upside. So it's this kind of crazy waves that we've seen with AVAX so far. And so more recently, what we can see is that kind of coming out of the summer, the UDPI identified that big move to the upside as getting up to kind of tapping out the upside potential. And indeed, we had quite a bit of consolidation that formed since then. And you see the UDPI kind of cooled off as we came out of that local top. And then now it's moving back up to the upside as, AVAX has gone on this parabolic rally. And so right now we're sitting a little bit below 3 currently. So not all the way at the top yet. So the model thinks there could still be more upside for AVAX to go, but it's starting to get cautious. It's starting to say that it's time to maybe get a little bit more cautious with AVAX, that is putting in such a big move now that it might not be able to sustain that for a whole lot longer. Now, we'll see. Again, it's not at the highest levels of risk, suggesting that it might be really overheating yet, but it's getting up there. It's moving up there with this parabolic rally. So let's talk a little bit more about where AVAX is right now. And I think a good way of doing that is just looking at the raw output of the model. So that's what I'm showing you here. This is just the UDPI level across time. So the UDPI is on the y-axis now. And as I mentioned, we're just sitting a bit below 3. But you'll see, look how the risk is shooting up with AVAX right now. Similar to what we've seen in the past, kind of as we come up to these higher levels of risk, we're this really steep angle on the UDPI here, this really steep increase. And what that's basically meaning is that the risk is shooting up right now. And so as the UDPI, or as AVAX kind of continues on its way, if parabolic rally continues, I would expect this to continue shooting up into these really high levels of risk. And so that's why this is suggesting it might be time to get a little more cautious with AVAX, that really the entry point was a few weeks ago, more recently, where we're kind of sitting here below 1. That might have been a good re-entry point from after this move here. Now we're starting to get to a point where it's probably getting a little bit risky. Now, that's not financial advice. You should make your own decisions and form your own strategies around this. But that's just what the model is suggesting, is that it currently thinks AVAX is getting a little bit hot right now. So one thing that I think is interesting to think about with AVAX, though, is that if it does continue to rally, or if it just kind of cools off for a bit, consolidates and moves back up, where can we kind of expect AVAX to go in the future? Because it does really seem to be going the way of something like Solana, just kind of following in those kind of footsteps just a few months later. And one of the big narratives around crypto right now, and something I've talked about in previous videos, is the idea of ecosystems, that the market really seems to be valuing alternative ecosystems separate from Ethereum. So, Ethereum has really high transaction fees right now. The gas fees are very expensive. Normal people can't afford to use it. Normal people can't spend $100 per transaction. So the market's looking for alternatives. The market is now starting to value alternatives that have, that have development on them, that have things like DeFi ecosystems and NFT ecosystems, but that combine that with low transaction fees and high scalability, which Avalanche has. It's very cheap to use. Avalanche can handle thousands of transactions per second, so it has those advantages over Ethereum. Kind of normal people can use Avalanche a lot more easily than they can use something like Ethereum. And so that's also likely what has propelled some other cryptos like Solana coming out of the summer. That was probably the big reason it caught on in such a huge way, or arguably that's the reason that happened. And then other ones that have run recently as well, things like Phantom, that also have DeFi ecosystems that are really growing on their platforms, and the market has seemed to be valuing that. And so from that perspective, I think it's interesting to look at where AVAX stands right now in terms of its market share of the DeFi ecosystem. So just taking one kind of segment of ecosystem development here, DeFi may be one of the more prominent ones that people are caring about right now, and comparing it with something like Solana, which put in a huge run, arguably on the back of its development in things like DeFi, but then also NFTs with Solana was a big thing. And what I think is interesting to think about right now is that the difference in market cap between Solana and AVAX is still pretty big. Solana, when I just checked before recording, was at about $70 billion in market cap, and AVAX was sitting down around $30 billion. And now, obviously, that's a huge appreciation with AVAX in a very short amount of time. It had been well below that not very long ago, so it's made a lot of moves and gains. But I think it's interesting to look at is if you just take one kind of measurement of ecosystem development, which is total value locked on DeFi, which might just suggest a combination of development as well as usage of the network for things like DeFi. AVAX is not that far behind Solana right now in total value locked in DeFi. So I pulled these graphs off of DeFi Llama, which is a great resource for looking at these metrics of how much value is stored in different chains or different DeFi protocols. And so what we can see is that Solana is, only a little bit more than 1% above AVAX currently in the total value locked, or at least when I looked at this chart last, these were the percentages. And I think this is interesting because if part of the thing that the market is valuing is these competitors that show that they're able to take some market share, if AVAX is still sitting at less than half the market share of Solana, but it's only about a 1% below Solana in terms of the total value locked, maybe that means that AVAX hasn't fully unlocked its potential yet. And so, the UDPI still gives us some room to move to the upside. This might be one thing you could look at to say that AVAX might still have some room to move upwards, potentially, in that it's if we assume that there's some connection between price and the amount of usage of the network, that might be a suggestion. Now, obviously, you have to be a little bit careful in these kind of cases of overly relying on fundamentals, because in these kind of cases where you have an asset like AVAX that's running or asset like Solana that's running, there's no guarantee that the value is actually really all that connected to its fundamental value, kind of the fundamental worth of the network, because you get people in speculating, people just dumping in money, chasing the momentum. So you have to be a little bit careful of how to interpret these kind of things, that, just because AVAX is catching up to Solana on the total value lock doesn't mean that the market has to value AVAX as highly as Solana. There could be other reasons why there's that disconnect, where AVAX, even if it has similar fundamental value, is undervalued relative to Solana for other kind of more arbitrary reasons that have nothing to do with the fundamentals. So you have to be a little bit careful. But I do just think this is an interesting thought experiment to think about, where if there is some connection, so just assuming there might be some connection between use of the network, demand of the token to use the network, etc., and the degree to which the market is valuing that particular asset, then this might be a suggestion that AVAX is really kind of caught up to Solana. And indeed, not very long ago, AVAX was way lower in its market share of DeFi. It's really been exploding of how much money is being locked in AVAX, that maybe there's still more value to be given to AVAX. Maybe it hasn't finished yet. And it wouldn't shock me if in not too terribly long of time, AVAX is itself sitting at a significantly higher market cap than where it is right now. If it might eventually be able to rival something like Solana. But there's no guarantee of when that's going to happen, right? The UDPI is thinking that this current parabolic rally is not totally done necessarily. It doesn't have to be totally done, that is. That it's not on the super high levels of risk. So if Solana keeps pumping, UDPI says that could happen, or it thinks that could happen. But that also doesn't mean that AVAX will keep pumping. It could end up having to consolidate now after this more recent parabolic move. We'll just have to see what happens. But the UDPI does think it's getting a little bit risky in the short term, or the shorter term. But these more fundamental trends might suggest that there's a lot to be bullish about for AVAX in a longer time frame. That if it continues to increase its DeFi market share, and it very well could surpass something like Solana, just depending on if that trend continues, maybe then it will actually become valued more. Now, who knows? That's all just speculation. We'll have to see what happens. But I think it's also then useful to think about if AVAX has done this based on its adoption, based on its increase in its market share and value locked on DeFi, are there other up-and-coming layer 1 protocols similar to AVAX that have low transaction fees, really high throughput, that might be kind of the next AVAX? So if AVAX was the next Solana in terms of what it just did with this price action, might there be some other one coming up? And so there might be ones like Phantom, for example, which has been increasing its market share reasonably, but still is I think it was about 1.8% or so when I just checked here. So not at the level of AVAX or Solana yet, but it's been growing. Maybe something like Phantom will be the next one that the market really turns to. Maybe people will take profits off of something like Avalanche and then move it into something like Phantom. Or it could be one of the other ones, something like Harmony, which has DeFi development. Some of the other chains that are kind of getting their ecosystems going, maybe those are going to be valued. It's just a thing that I'm going to be watching personally, that I'm just going to be kind of looking at these metrics, see which chains are really kind of growing in their kind of ecosystem development, and maybe they'll be the next ones that get a lot of attention and really appreciate in price. But of course, that's not guaranteed at all. Currently, the market seems to really be valuing these layer 1 protocols that have a lot of ecosystem development going on to them, but there's no guarantee that is going to continue forever. The market could decide that it wants to value something else now instead. It could move on to the next kind of thing, and then that'll be the big thing that becomes value. So you never really know if these trends are going to continue. But it's something I'm going to be watching, and it wouldn't shock me if other ones of these layer 1s with a lot of ecosystem development are the next ones to really go put in major moves. Now, again, that's not financial advice. You should form your own opinions about these kind of things. That's just some speculation on my part, some things that I'm watching. So to wrap up with Avalanche of where we stand right now, we're at a score of 2.84, so that's the absolute score when I pulled this off of the UDPI. It has been updating because AVAX has been quite volatile recently, so the exact value might be a little bit different than this, but it's around a 2.84. And so, of course, what that means is that the downside potential is quite a bit larger than the upside potential right now for AVAX. That has kind of been realizing a lot of the upside potential that the model thinks it currently has. And it's not all the way at the top, right? So if AVAX keeps pumping, the model thinks it still could move more to the upside. But it's also suggesting that it's getting into this overheated territory. That wouldn't be very surprising if this current run is about at its limit, and if we're going to have to cool off a bit to some of these lower risk zones before we can put another major leg up into the upside. So when you're interpreting these numbers, you always just have to think about that. Do you think that AVAX is done yet with this parabolic move, in which case there is still some room to move to the upside? But my personal look at this is I think that AVAX is becoming a bit risky right now. That personally, I would not see this as a great entry point. Now, again, that's not financial advice. You should form your own opinions about those things. But I personally think that AVAX just looking a little bit overheated right now. That this parabolic move, I don't personally expect it to keep moving, but I could absolutely be wrong. Who knows? This is crypto. Anything can happen. AVAX could go to $300 for all I know. Who knows what's going to happen. But my personal opinion looking at this is I think AVAX is probably going to need some time to consolidate before it's ready to put another big leg up into the upside. But it has been very impressive what it's been doing so far, so we'll just have to wait and see. So then to look at kind of where AVAX stands relative to a lot of other cryptos across the space. So if you've been following the channel, you know that we're following a bunch of different assets kind of in real time. So we're up to 20 different assets now that we have UDPIs for. We're adding more every week, so follow the channel if you want to get updates and stay apprised of those new assets that we put out, as well as updates about the assets we're already monitoring. And you can see here, AVAX being down here in the bottom right corner, it's pretty high risk. It's the highest risk asset currently of all the ones that we've been following. DOT had been the highest level of risk. It's since been cooling off. DOT had been up a little bit over 3 or a ways over 3. Now it's cooling off down to about 2. AVAX is at 2.84. We'll see if AVAX's run continues. This could keep on increasing, or if AVAX has a correction or needs to consolidate, maybe that'll start falling. But we can really then compare that just across other assets that we're seeing. And as you can see, AVAX is quite overheated, but then other assets at the same time, Atom actually just has put in a nice 8% move today, so that is actually a little bit moved up. It had been further down the negatives, but Algo's been sitting out in the negatives for a while. ADA has been in the negatives. XRP, HBAR to a certain degree has also been lower risk. So when you compare it, AVAX does seem to be one of the more overheated within the space relative to these other ones here. And of course, something that we've talked about is that the usefulness of looking at this thing is that if one were to be taking profits off of an overheated asset, then one can just look at other assets that might be not overheated yet, and that might offer some indication of other assets that might be able to put moves into the upside later. Now, again, it's not financial advice. You should make your own decisions about what to do, whether to take profits off of an asset like AVAX or where to put it. But that's just something that we talk about a lot, is the usefulness of having these different risk indicators, that oftentimes these really high risk ones are unlikely to put big moves to the upside in the near future after that, and it tends to be more of these lower risk assets that are able to kind of put in more performance in the nearer future. So just something that we keep an eye on here at Upside Down Data. So if you like the content, remember to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, and follow us on Twitter. And remember, with UDPI, we're all going to make it.